I tend to look at the transcript first because I use the transcript in many ways as my roadmap for the rest of the application. So really wanting to get a sense of, again, based on what the school offers, has the student opted to challenge themselves? Have they taken additional coursework?
Hi, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. Excited to have you, and I'm so excited about today's episode. So, last week, we held a panel discussion with former admissions officers and application readers to talk about what really happens inside an admissions office. And this was such a great discussion. I even learned things, and I've been doing this for 20 years. Of course, I've never worked in an admissions office, so of course there was a lot for me to learn about that side of the desk. And I'm excited to share it with you today. So let's jump right into it. What we're here to talk about today, college admissions consulting. And we've got some great experts in the room, Joanna Graham and James Hayashi, and I will let them introduce themselves in a moment. Now, Joanna's been with Signet for, I think, 2 years now, but has been in admissions for a very long time. James is a new friend of Signet, so we have a lot of friends in common. So I know he's going to share great information with you as well. So before we get into the actual what happens in the black box, we know that this is a complex process, and it's made even more complicated by dealing with teenagers who, are at varying levels of communication or confidence or surety about what it is they want to do and where they want to study and things like that. So we want to give you as much help and assistance as we can. And please stay tuned to our events page. We do one of these sessions every month meant to be helping you guide your child through the high school process and college process. And next month in February, we'll be doing a session on the new changes to standardized testing. There are some upcoming changes to the ACT. I want you all to understand what they are, where they're coming from, and what it means for your college process, if anything. And we'll cover the changes that happened to the SAT last year and what we've learned about them as well. Okay, that's my housekeeping. Let's start with some quick introductions. Joanna and James, if you could just tell us a little bit about your experience in admissions, where you've read applications, and how long, that'd be great. Joanna, let's start with you.
So, hi everyone. My name is Joanna Graham. I'm based in Northern Virginia, just right outside of the Washington, D.C. area. I have been working in the higher ed admissions adjacent space now for 23 years. I built a whole corporate career as a chief marketing and product officer in the education and nonprofit space. But before that, I worked both on the standardized testing side as well as in admissions. I read applications at Georgetown for a couple of years. And in more recent years, I've read both undergrad and grad applications at a handful of universities, both in California as well as the state of Florida. I've been a part of the Signet team now for, I think Sheila said, I think I'm in my second cycle now, but I've been advising both high school students as well as young professionals on both college and pre-MBA admissions now for 23 years. And so delighted to be here with you all and share a couple of insights.
Thanks, Joanna. James, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I guess in kind of similar to Joanna, but maybe a little bit less time and duration. Been helping students with their applications for about the last decade or so. And of the last 4 years, I think, on the admissions reader side, been looking at USC applications, undergrad, first year, and transfer applications.
Excellent. Both of you are going to have great perspectives to share from different ends of the country and, slightly different types of institutions, which we do want to keep in mind. The process is not exactly the same at any college. So we're really only representing the institutions we know, and sort of we'll give you general information about how the process works and all of that from based on that information. So I would like to start with some real basics. I know we've got some parents of juniors in the room. They may know a little bit more about this process, but just speaking very broadly, when we say read an application, what are you actually reading? Joanna, let's start with you.
Thank you, Sheila, for caveating everything by saying the process is different at multiple universities. And admittedly, the schools where I've read applications, the process has varied in terms of committee size. But by and large, when you think about sort of what is being read, most universities are employing what they call a holistic approach. And so they're looking at everything that a student is submitting. The application includes starting with your transcript. So all of your grades from your high school courses, any additional coursework you've taken. They are going to look at test scores. So whether it be SAT, ACT, AP exams, things like that. And then obviously the big thing, the big elephant in the room that everyone talks about, the essays. And so obviously, the essays are a big component. How they're evaluated is going to vary school by school. We'll get more into that, I'm sure, in the conversation. But then also they're going to take a look at things at other supplemental things too. So letters of recommendation are going to be incredibly important. If the school like Georgetown offers students an opportunity to interview, they're going to look at that interview report as well. And then really just the other pieces, I would say the ancillary pieces are things like the activity list, descriptions. Again, those are going to vary school by school, whether you're applying to a Common App-based school or a school like the UCs where activity descriptions vary a little bit. But at a high level, that's essentially, those are all the major components of the application that are being evaluated.
James, anything to add to that long list?
I think because we're all looking at the same pieces, like Joanna alluded to, every school is going to weight the different pieces a little bit differently. But if you're a private school or even a public school in certain cases, you'll be looking at the Common App. So the pieces are essentially the same because you're submitting that same application. The only thing I would add is I kind of go essentially front to back through the Common App. So my tip would be, especially if you're a parent and you've never gone through the application process yet, create like maybe a fake Common App or UC account just to see what information you're putting in there, because that's exactly what we'll be seeing. I saw it because I go front to back. I start with actually the demographic stuff. So I'm finding out what major is a student interested in, and that kind of is a filter that I look at the whole application through. Parent background information, like what are the parents' professions and is that related to the kids' major or career interest? Are the parents recently divorced? And that gives me, insight into potential turbulence in the household in the high school years. Yeah, so just that demographic stuff. Where does the student come from in terms of their school district, their neighborhood? Because all those pieces are kind of in there. And I just use that as a background as I'm looking through everything else that Joanna mentioned.
That's great. I love that you went into that level of detail. And that tip is so essential. I have a fake Common App account where I pretend I'm the student. When you go to create an account, it'll ask you if you're a parent, a student, or an educator. I always pretend I'm the student because I want to know exactly what the student is seeing and what they're responding to. The other tip that I would give you that's related to that is to look on the Common App website at the list of forms that need to be submitted. You won't submit them. You won't need to print them and then fill them out and submit them. Everything that you need to submit will go through the Common Application. But then you can see the kind of questions that your students' teachers will be responding to. Their counselor will be responding to the kind of questions that they need to answer about, the size of the school and whether they rank and, all of these other things. So that can be really helpful for a parent to just be aware of, right? That this is all information that gets communicated to the office. So yeah, great. Thank you for that addition. Okay. Now, either one of you open it up. When you read an application, what are you doing? Are you just reading and reserving judgment? Are you taking notes? Are you annotating on a piece of software? How are your thoughts as an admissions reader getting logged?
So at USC, we have our own little platform. I'm sure every university does. And I have a little card in which I could put any notes that I'm going to pass along to the next group of people who will read. Maybe for context, I'm a first round reader. So when I'm looking at application, after I'm done, I have 3 buttons I can push. One is consider for scholarship. The next is go to the next round. And the last one is likely to deny. And so I have a little electronic notepad that I'm taking notes on. Anything positive, negative, or just that just stands out in some other way that I pass along to the next group of people that will look if the student makes it that far. I would say the transcript, and a lot of people think of it as GPA, but it really is transcript, right? Meaning not just what's that 3 point whatever or 4 point something grade that you're looking at, but what classes has the student taken relative to what's offered at their school? How do those classes kind of inform or interact with the student's potential major? Is there a trend in grades going up or down? And also what's the level of rigor? And then I look at all the pieces that Joanna just talked about and kind of make notes. Again, anything that stands out as interesting that I'd want the next person to pay attention to.
That's so great. You're full of juicy nuggets, and we're definitely going to get into the process. So I love hearing that there are those 3 buttons. But before we do that, Joanna, what's it like for you? How are you leaving your thoughts?
So usually it's, so at Georgetown, there's a multi-person committee that's reviewing every application. And so you review applications in a silo essentially. And so that way you can't be swayed by your peers. When I read applications, I've always been super old school. I mean, I like taking handwritten notes. I process information better when I'm able to do that, quite frankly. But it is up to the reader in terms of how they're going to log that and catalog it. The things that I'm typically looking for, very similar to, I'm going to echo what James said here too, looking for trends or looking for things that sort of stand out as inconsistencies. That's one of the first things. I tend to look at the transcript first because I use the transcript in many ways as my roadmap for the rest of the application. So really wanting to get a sense of, again, based on what the school offers, has the student opted to challenge themselves? Have they taken additional coursework? If there are some blemishes or some weaknesses, then immediately looking to see if there's a supplemental statement that they've included with their application to explain some of that. I think admissions officers oftentimes get a bad rap for looking for reasons to say no. And the reality is, and I tell every family this, admissions officers are typically looking to give you the benefit of the doubt. You never want to sort of leave it to them in that little bubble to make an assumption or to make a decision based on something that feels really ambiguous. You want to walk that fine line between over communicating. And I always tell students, there's a fine line between explaining something and either providing an excuse or kind of going over the top. But you do want to provide context. If there's something that just looks funky or there's something that looks off or inconsistent, take the extra space. There's a reason why there's that additional info session on the Common App for students to be able to include some additional context around really just life is really the way I always explain it to families. And believe it or not, admissions officers really do have a heart and do have a soul and conscience and are looking for reasons to be a student's cheerleader.
Yes, they're real people. But at the same time, like I feel like you're sort of superhuman people because I know you're reading lots of applications. And Joanna, if you like writing by hand your notes, and then you're probably going to have to communicate those notes to somebody else, that takes a long time. So, 2 questions here, and we'll stick with you, Joanna. How long do you spend on a single application? And I don't know if you have an exact number, but on average, how many do you read in a given season?
So when I read applications at Georgetown, I was reading specifically for the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was reading anywhere between 1,500 and 3,000 applications a cycle. And there was obviously an extended period of time over which I covered those, and they were broken out and chunked out into different tiers. And obviously the different phases. So for parents maybe who are earlier in the process, most schools are going to offer some version of either early action or early decision, and then you'll have regular decision, which is a later cycle that typically starts in January. So they are spread out in some ways. But typically over the course of a given cycle, it's anywhere from 1,500 to 3,000. It varied. There were 5 readers for each application in total. There were 2 student readers, 1 admissions officer, and 2 faculty. And everyone received an equal vote, which I always thought was a fascinating model. Not every school does it this way, but that was the model when I read. The other thing I would say, is that in terms of time, it would vary. There were some applications you moved through very, very quickly. And when we get into sort of the nitty-gritty in process, we can certainly talk about what some of those things were. But to truly get through an application on average, and I always hate to tell people this because I know how much time kids spend working on applications, but it was typically less than 3 minutes on an application. And admittedly, I mean, there is a good bit of training that goes into into sort of prepping people on how to get through an application. Again, that would say that's an average. If there was an application that was incredibly thoughtful, comprehensive, which deserved a little bit of a deeper dive, you would spend a bit more time. But on average, I would say the average was around 3 minutes typically. The other thing that I will mention too, and I think in terms of just giving families guidance is, and I tell this to students all the time, is that you want to believe that the person reading your application is going to be doing so at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning when they have a cup of coffee, they're well rested, they've had a lovely weekend, and they're fully caffeinated, and they're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And the reality was that given the sheer volume, oftentimes the person reading your application, it might be 3 in the morning on a Friday night, and you are the 300th application they've read that day. It goes without saying, I always tell folks, it's so important to think about how to make yourself stand out, how to write in a way that's going to capture someone's attention, because you want to believe that the person reading your application is doing so 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. But the reality is you may be getting someone who's a little bit fried at the end of a very long week. And so anything that you can do to try to stand out, to make your intros a little snappier, to capture their attention is certainly going to help as much as possible.
Yeah, give them a little gift.
Mhm.
And, referring to your like average 3 minutes, I've seen, 2 or 3 minutes to, 5 to 8 minutes maybe per application. I think it really does depend on the load. But the thing that I always tell students when they hear that number and they're like crushed, like I spent months on that essay and they're going to spend a matter of seconds on it, is I remind them their favorite novels, their favorite poems. It might take them a matter of hours to read, but it certainly took more than a matter of hours for somebody to write that masterpiece, right? We have to put a lot of time and thought and craft into creating the impression you want to create for it to land in a minute or 2 minutes or whatever it is, right? So don't be too discouraged by that number. James, anything to add there in terms of how long you spend on an application or how many you typically read?
Yeah, so we're told about 15 minutes is what we're aiming for, so maybe a little bit more time. But that is an average. So there are some applications that it's a lot less. If I can tell, the student just is not ready for the type of rigor that USC expects of its applicants. And then sometimes it could be a little bit more than that. In terms of numbers, all of the part-time seasonal readers are given 50 a week. So it's about 200 a month. So that's about 800 a season, give or take, and we can ask for more when we have more time, and we could tell USC we're taking fewer if we're busy during the week, but it's about 50 a week.
That's helpful context. Do you want to explain also what a part-time seasonal reader is versus a full admissions officer?
Sure. So the full-time team, most of them, I think pretty much everyone, unless your director is like a regional territory representative. So during the year, they're traveling to places, they're representing SC at school fairs, and talking to students. And then that's their full-time job. That during reading season, they're in their office reading applications for probably 39 of the 40 hours a week. Seasonal people like me come in just for, November to about January, February for USC and read, and we typically have some other job that may be related to admissions and maybe not, but we all have some kind of experience in that arena. So they let us come in and supplement because schools like SC get so many applications. So at the end of whenever it is, January or February, when the bulk of the applications are in, I kind of go away and wait till the next October, November before I start reading again.
Great. And this is a great place to pivot into actually that process, right? So I'm sure the process was very different at both of your institutions, but James, walk us through what is the typical like process and, where are the selection points that would happen for an average application?
Yeah, so many of you may know the early action, early decision kind of distinction and regular decision. So we start, of course, in November 1st. All of the early action applications are in for USC. So right after that, they assign it to us. We start reading, and I go through the parts that I had mentioned. And as I said, there's like 3 different options for those early applicants that I can decide from, either consider for scholarship. I'd say like maybe 2 to 5% of the kids I'll put that in, and then move on to the next level. Because SC has about, in the last few years, a 9-10% admit rate, I try to do like maybe 15% of the applications that I'm pushing through, and I figure the team will kind of, make the final selection for who that last 9 or 10% is. And then the rest are likely to deny. Let's see. After that, I look at the regular decision pool. So once all the early action kids are done, we look at the regular decision students. And for USC, those students are no longer eligible for a scholarship. So I just have consider for next round or likely to deny. And then after that, we look at transfer students once the first years are all in.
If a student gets the consider for next round, do you know
Mhm.
what happens then?
I believe that they go to the department read. So whatever major that the student has chosen, the department will look at them. The process is like slightly different for the portfolio programs. So dance, music, architecture, any of those categories, the department usually looks at their materials first, including their portfolio. Then, if they really like whatever artistic or architectural material the students produced, they'll send it to the academic readers, and we have to say like, yes, the student looks academically ready, or no, their art might be great, but we don't think they're academically qualified. So the process is a little reversed if you're in a portfolio type program. So that's the only distinction there.
That's helpful. So my understanding is that at many schools, or maybe, I don't know if we can quantify it as most colleges that use a holistic review system, which means there's like no formula, there are no cutoffs, right? Everything is really considered in the context of each student's background. What we're expecting the process to be is that there is a like sort of a first reader, there may be a second reader, there may be two people reading it at the same time, and they kind of weigh in. And then based on the region, the applications are assigned to certain people to read it, right? These are the people who are, like, as you said, traveling. They're very familiar with the schools in that state or that couple of states that they're in charge of. So they really understand the context. And then after that, they go to a committee meeting where it's less regional, but those regional officers are sort of presenting the applicant. And then there's some discussion and then maybe an up or down vote. Joanna, is that your experience?
Yes. Yeah, no, you've covered it well. And I think that also underscores, I think, the importance to, if you're, and I saw a question pop up in the chat about counselor recommendations. I think it's really important to make sure that, when you think about that secondary school report and really how to leverage your counselor as an advocate, this is a key area, I think, for students to be proactive, particularly if you're looking at more selective schools. Obviously, counselors are going to be handling portfolios and accounts for a wide variety of students. And so, but if you're looking at some of the more selective schools and especially if you have a high school, that has sent students to a particular institution, I think that is a place where the secondary school report, where the counselor recommendation certainly can weigh a little bit more heavily, if that makes sense, because that it is important to give the admissions officer sort of that context around the rigor at that particular school. I know for a fact that there have been a couple of institutions where when admissions officers or regional folks leave an institution after a certain period of time and are replaced by new folks, there can be a little bit of an adjustment period while the new folks coming in are getting sort of are getting to know the schools in their particular territory. And so again, I think it's incumbent on the students to make sure that you're liaising with your counselor to make sure that they are being an advocate for you as much as possible.
Thanks for tackling that question. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like in that final decision committee? It sounds like at Georgetown there were a lot of voices in the room, but what's happening?
Or so, I mean, it varies, and I think you captured it well. I mean, there typically are going to be folks who are going to be advocates for a particular student, and then you may have folks who feel differently. And the beauty of it is, at every institution where they have some type of model like this, is that the diversity of the committee is designed to create that discourse and that conversation, because each individual is going to bring a unique perspective to the table. Each individual around that table is going to be looking and valuing very different things. So even though every member of the committee has had sort of the same training, they're innately going to value sort of different things in looking at an applicant. And so it is, when you have folks who are lobbying, who are advocating for students, I try to explain this to students, you want to build your application in a way that is so that you're conveying the most important things to you, the things that, that really sort of make you uniquely you. But you also want to think a little bit about, if you have someone in that room who's advocating on your behalf, what's the headline? So if they're presenting you to committee, how are they going to describe you in one sentence? And so, again, help them be your advocate, essentially, in many ways when you're thinking about putting together your application. I think it's a common question that we oftentimes get from families too, that, is it better to be a generalist and good at a lot of things, or is it better to be a specialist? Is it easier to write that headline if you have a child who's a specialist in one or two things? And not saying we have to tackle that. That's probably a topic for an entirely different webinar. But I do think that it is helpful when you are the student, you're putting together your application, though, don't go too broad and too shallow. You want to make sure that, if someone is trying to give a recap of who you are in your application, there should be a headline, essentially, because in more cases than not, the person who is advocating for you in that room is going to have to come up with a headline or sort of a quick executive summary on who you are and what is the value that you bring to that university.
That's very helpful to think about. Okay, so let's move kind of out of the nuts and bolts into maybe the little bit more of the evaluative preferences. I have heard from various members of our team, former admissions officers from, many different kinds of schools, about what they like to read first. And almost everybody has a different answer. And there's no sort of prescribed order. You have to read it in. I've got people who like to look at the transcript first. I got people who like to look at the essays without any context first, or maybe even the activities list. So for each of you, knowing these are just your particular preferences and it's not necessarily standard, what are the things you like to look at first? And how do you reconcile that first impression from whatever it is you were looking at with the other information that you will gather from, reading the other parts of the application?
So I start with the transcript, and I think I had mentioned this a little earlier. I use the transcript as my roadmap, and so I'm looking first off to see, did the student challenge themselves? What courses did they choose to take? And I think, James, you mentioned this a little bit earlier. I'm also looking to see, does the transcript align with, potentially what is the student, which school is the student applying to within the university? What major are they potentially declaring? Are there consistencies? Are there trends and patterns? Essentially, does the transcript back up what they're declaring in the rest of their application? And then I go to the essays. That's the next piece that I look at, because the essay is really the place where the story comes to life. And so you look for, again, some of those trends, those patterns, those consistency. Do the things that you see in the transcript, are those reflected in the essay, the students' hopes, dreams, activities, how they've connected things? Or if they're not, is there an explanation in the essay why, maybe you have a student who spent the first 3 years of high school thinking that they were going to pursue STEM, and then maybe did up their summer program after junior year and all of a sudden realized or decided that they don't want to pursue STEM. They are in love with humanities and want to be a history major or something. So then I'm looking for a bit of an explanation and a little bit of the why. So, so as I mentioned earlier, so much of this is you want to give, admissions folks are trying to give students the benefit out. Like, let's, help me understand what was happening in your brain when you made these decisions. Why did you choose to do the things that you did? Why did you choose to pursue the courses that you did? And then how does that translate into the university? I would say for students who are undeclared, I'm oftentimes looking for, again, probably then a bit more diversity in the transcript and some explanation in the application, explaining why did you choose to take all of these different courses? What were the things that you were hoping to learn? What have you learned from that? And how has that influenced what you might want to study in college, or at least the direction that you're headed? So again, it really is all about sort of thinking about the entire application kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. So every piece of the application sort of plays a very distinct role, and there should be enough tangential overlap that when you look at it holistically and together, it all makes sense. But each piece really should present a slightly different aspect of the applicant in a slightly different and unique way.
Yeah, and those pieces have to fit together, like you're saying, right? Which is, a difficult job, but that is why we think of the application actually as a portfolio, right? Like all of these pieces need to speak to each other and tell a really compelling story. James, what do you like to look at first, and how do you, manage that impression of a student?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I sort of go front to back through the Common App, and the first sections are parents' occupation and educational background. I also just, again, for those of you who've never looked at the app, you can request a fee waiver if your income isn't high enough to pay for the application. So that also just gives me a little bit of insight into the family's financials if they've requested the application fee waiver. So I go through all the kind of demographic pieces. It's maybe 3 pages of different questions the students answered. And then the very next thing I look at is the transcript, because that helps me know, like I said, all those pieces in terms of not just what are their grades, but what courses have they taken. The transcript usually comes with maybe like a 1 to 5 page document about the high school. So even if a person is not familiar with that high school yet, they can look and see what's the average SAT score, what's the average number of AP classes, how many AP classes are offered, what's the average GPA at this high school. So I get a little bit of background on who is the student in the context of what their high school is and what their high school offers. And then kind of to round out the academic part, I look at test scores. So SAT, if they've submitted that, because USC is test optional, and then AP scores. I am looking there for, like, if you've taken 2 AP classes and you don't have any AP scores, I'm like, no, that's probably fine. If you've taken like 10 AP or IB courses and you've submitted like no scores, that's like just a question I have. And like Joanna said, we don't like questions, we like information. So there's a reason why the student has taken 20 AP classes but 0 tests or isn't submitting any test scores. It's good to let us know that, and then the additional information just explain. And then I'm, of course, particularly interested in if there's an AP test or score that's relevant to the student's major. I'm focusing in on that to say, like, what does this standardized assessment say about the student's relative ability in whatever area, English or history or something. Then after that, I look at activities, which I think is kind of one of the maybe the underrated parts of the application. I always tell students and families, if you think about your life and you divide it into school and not school is the majority of your time because it's evenings, weekends, afternoons, summer vacation, winter break. So it's a big chunk of time, and we just want to know, like, what are you doing with that time? It doesn't have to be a school sport or a club or some official volunteering, but I'm like, what do you do? Do you help your family because your grandparent is elderly and needs assistance? Do you just really love reading and you do 2 novels a month? Like, just how is a student using their time? After that, I look at the personal statement. And obviously, as we were saying, it probably will overlap with some parts of the activity list, but I'm looking for new information that I didn't already get. Sometimes a student is sort of reiterating what I can already see in the activity section. I like to know, like, not just what did you do, but why did you do it? I think that that's a good use of that personal statement. Like, why did you do it? What did you learn? How did you grow? Maybe you decided you didn't like this thing anymore, and that was a lesson, and that's helpful for me to know about you too. So, all of that, and then the USC supplement. Our typical question is, how are you going to pursue your first and or second choice majors at USC? So I'm looking for the student to talk about their interest in the major, but also showing me they've done their homework on the school and they know specifics about why they want to study that thing at this particular college. And then lastly, I look at the letters of recommendation. That will usually, like in the best cases, it supplements everything I've kind of thought that I knew about the student. Like, the student seems really generous and social. And the counselor will say, the student is generous and social. I'm like, okay, great. There's a person who actually knows this kid and they're saying everything that I picked up from the application. Sometimes they give me new information, circumstances the student didn't mention, clubs or activities the student didn't say. So it's really helpful, I think, that there's some adult somewhere, whether it's a teacher or a counselor, kind of on the back end, giving me all this extra stuff that I can work with and then put into my little report.
That's great. There's so many little nuggets coming out here. I want to ask two more questions, and actually I'm going to switch the order that I'm going to ask you them because of the comment that we got about test scores in the chat here. Since test optional started, I think, but especially since COVID, when 95% of colleges went test optional, and so many parents were like skeptical of, wait, are you really test optional? Or do you really want to score and you're just saying you're test optional? I think over 400 colleges came together to say, no, we really are test optional. We assure you that if you apply without a test score, you will not be disadvantaged in any way. It has actually created more questions, I think, than answers, because a lot of people are like, well, if one student, you have this piece of information, another student, you don't have this information, how can you not even just, subconsciously prefer the student who gives you more information about, their academic ability? So I'm curious if either of you have anything to share about what it's like reading an application with a test score and what it's like without a test score, and how you kind of manage to not disadvantage or overly advantage, one or the other of those students.
So I will say, when I read applications at Georgetown, it was pre-COVID. But Georgetown also is one of the schools that does require test scores, though. And in some ways, so I'll weigh in actually, because a couple of the schools that I have read applications for in the last 2 cycles are test optional. So I'll kind of speak from those university lenses. One of the things that I find, at least that I found in my experience, is that when admissions committees are evaluating international applicants. So oftentimes in the US, there's a bit more consistency across high schools, the types of courses students are taking and the level of rigor and things like that. What I found when I was reading applications from international applicants, in many ways, those test scores, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Those test scores sometimes are more important because in some ways it gives admissions officers an opportunity to feel like they're kind of comparing apples to apples. So if you studied at the University of Myanmar, how do you compare that level of rigor to a student coming from a university or coming from a high school, say in Shanghai or Singapore or Des Moines, Iowa? And so for many admissions officers, when there isn't always an easier, intuitive way to sort of compare those types of applicants, and granted, in many universities, those applicants are also being put into different buckets. So international students are being compared to other international students. But I think overall, when you really start thinking about, are students going to be able to handle the rigor at a particular university, those test scores and those data points can provide some additional insight to give schools a sense of, do they have the potential, do they have the academic capability to perform well in the classroom here? No, I will say, and I have some interesting exposure here on the grad side as well too, because I think on the grad side of admissions, you tend to see more studies, psychometric studies on correlation basically between test scores and first year GPA and things like that. I'm not a psychometrician. I will start by saying that, but I'd like to think I played one on TV if I were ever to be cast as one, but just kidding. But the reality is of it is, in undergraduate admissions, I think most folks will tell you that there is less of a correlation between performance in the classroom and performance on the SAT or the ACT as opposed to, say, a graduate assessment. So I realize that that's probably a lot of data that's coming from a couple of different sources, but I think it is important when you're thinking about the decision that's right for you in terms of, do you take the standardized test or not? Do you submit the standardized score or not? I do think it's important for students and families to really consider sort of the larger context, though. How is that score being used? Who is in your competitive set? And the other thing that I tell families too is, if you are making that decision to invest time and energy in preparing for a standardized test, it's all about trade-offs. And so what are you giving up in order to invest that maybe 20, 30, 40 hours into preparing for the SAT or the ACT? Could that time be better spent doing something else that actually shows up on your activity list? And so again, those are, I think, just some of the broader questions for folks to consider besides just do I submit or not? How is it evaluated? What's the weight? How many stars does a 1500 on the SAT get me? So I just encourage families to think a bit more holistically and a little more broadly about questions like testing.
Yeah. And we'll definitely be digging more into this in our session next month on testing. James, how does test optional kind of play out at USC when you're reading?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you look at and for context, I love data. I think it's helpful beyond just the feelings we have or the intuitions. So if you look at the data for SC in particular, the admit rate for students with scores and without scores is virtually identical. So you can kind of see there, we say we're test optional and we truly are test optional. If you just look at the numbers, there doesn't look like there's any advantage to submitting a score. That said, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, my director said that they sent out a informal anonymous survey to all the students who were like actually first year students. And they said, did you take an SAT? And I think it was 99, 98% of the students said, yes, I took one. And certainly wasn't 98% who had submitted one. So we know virtually everyone is taking a test. And if you're submitting it, it's because you think your score is competitive or you're proud of it, or maybe some people are just submitting it everywhere. So, and I think that's my intuition is, or my guess and my hunch from talking to a lot of colleagues is that's kind of true at most colleges where they assume that most people are taking a score. If you're not submitting it at a test optional place, it's because you didn't want to. So you can't really get around the fact that people are assuming that you probably have a score. That said, I really like the piece of information Joanna gave, or the advice to think about the trade-offs. So I would say things like, how is that score being read at the schools that you really want to go to or you're applying into? I believe Chicago is still test optional, but if you go to their website and read their verbiage, it says we expect that the vast majority of students are taking a test and, in parentheses, then kind of in probably submitting one. So they are test optional, but they really prefer to see one, right? And so think about the schools and also what could you be doing with that time. If you know you're just not a great test taker and it's going to take a massive amount of energy and effort to get your score up, it might be better spent doing something, one, that you're really going to like, and two, that's going to advance your application in ways that a test score may not. And if you're like at a 1570 and you just really think you want to get a 1600, again, think about how much time and energy that's going to take and what you could do with that instead.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of times it's time to stop. There are better things you can do with your time. And to answer, Dave, your question specifically, every school is going to treat a test score differently for almost every student, depending on what the strengths are in their application, right? Students applying to the same school to the same major who have different, rigors of the general high school classes they've taken or taken more AP classes or have done, something more significant with their summers that really shows their academic, ability or something like that. So a test score is going to be a little different. In your particular case where your daughter has a really good ACT score, but not perfect grades and limited extracurriculars, that score is probably going to help them in the process just because it's going to assure the admissions officers, oh, this student is actually capable. There may be some other story going on with the grades that you may want to tell in the application, But I don't want you to think that having even a perfect ACT score is going to completely overshadow, mediocre grades, right? It's not like a trade-off in that sense. Well, we could have gone on forever, and I'm sure we'll do another event like that where we get really wonderful insights from admissions officers and readers. And I hope that you will submit your questions. We are doing a couple of episodes in a Q&A format. I've got a couple of episodes coming up that are in the live coaching format where we are working directly with a student or a parent. And if you would like to submit a question or come on for some coaching, we would be glad to have you. You can check the show notes for how to do that. And hope to see you next time with another great episode. Thanks, everybody, and take care.